Well, thank you very much for your warm welcome. I enjoyed last night and the interaction also today with the faculty and students at the Divinity College. I've enjoyed the very nice weather and the beauty of the countryside. And I'd like to come back again, I think. Anyway, thank you very much. Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls is an extensive topic, and this is why two of the lectures are introduced, Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls number 1, and then Jesus and the Dead Sea Scrolls number 2. It's just, we can't do all of this in one lecture, and really can only survey the most principal features in 2 lectures. But I think you'll find tonight's material very intriguing. There are 4 documents from Cave 4 that we want to look at with special interest this evening. And Professor Trites just told me a few minutes ago that he's climbed into Cave 4. The Jewish authorities, of course, frown on that kind of activity, but I won't say anything about it. But in any case, he's been inside and went in through what they call the skylight, that is to enter through the top into the cave. It's very dangerous to try to come up the side of the embankment, the escarpment where the cave is located. Well, there are 4 documents from this cave that are of special interest for Jewish messianism in antiquity and for the light they shed on certain features relating to Jesus and his teaching. So we will look at them tonight. They are 4Q246. 4Q246. And the 4 means cave number 4. Q, of course, stands for Qumran. And the 246 is the document number. There are over 500 documents from Cave 4 alone. And in one television special, I think it was aired, Mysteries of the Bible or something like that, aired on A&E, it was referred to as the mother lode of the 11 caves. This is where most of the scrolls were found. 867 scrolls at last count. 867 scrolls in all 11 caves, plus other related caves. 220 of those scrolls are scrolls of the Bible. Of the Old Testament, as we usually count the Old Testament books, 39 Old Testament books, 38 of those books are represented at Qumran. Does anyone know which book is not represented among the scrolls, among the Bible scrolls? I think I heard someone say it. Esther, that is correct. For various reasons, probably calendrical, because Esther champions a calendar not accepted by the Essenes, not accepted among the other calendars found at Qumran. Esther likely was left out. And since the community was made up of men and celibates, maybe they didn't care about the romantic intrigues and interests of Esther either. I'm not sure. There is no fragment of Nehemiah also found. However, Ezra is found, and because Ezra and Nehemiah were usually joined together at this period of time, it is assumed then that Nehemiah probably was there. There are approximately 100,000 fragments. And so when we talk about how many scrolls, that's why we say at last count, because we're not really sure. These fragments are being combined and joined and sometimes separated as we study them, and with the aid of computer technology, special lighting effects, and so on, we're able to make joins that could not be made 20 or 30 years ago. And so we may have a heap of fragments that we think belong together, and then later discover that, no, actually, some of these fragments are a different document. And so we've just added one more number, and so the total would jump to 868. Then we find that 2 other heaps that we thought were separate really do belong together. And so now you subtract 1 from the total. And that's why this number actually fluctuates. And so we may never know for sure, even years from now, what the actual total is. But the job is demanding, as you can imagine. One scholar put it this way: just imagine taking hundreds of puzzles and pitching the pieces onto the floor, stirring them up, and then throwing away 2/3 of the pieces, covering what you have left over with dirt and letting it become discolored and damaged, and then dig up those pieces and attempt to reconstruct the puzzles. And oh, by the way, the box lids that show you what they're to look like, they've been thrown away too. And that's the challenge of reconstructing the scrolls, and that's partly why it's taken so many years. And that's why so many scrolls from Cave 4, where most of them were found, that's why these scrolls have been so long coming to light. So all of the fragments were made available, pictures of them and transcribed text in the early 90s, and scholars today are still working their way through these various fragments and scraps. In fact, one scholar said that's really how they should be referred to, is not the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the Dead Sea Fragments, because they are in so many pieces. The scrolls that you've seen pictures of, I suspect, in popular presentations and in books and so on, are scrolls mostly found in Cave 1. These are the scrolls that were well preserved, rolled up, and placed in jars for the most part. One gentleman last night brought his jar with him. Yes, you can get souvenir jars about this tall with a little lid and a sample scroll rolled up and put inside. Well, 4 of the scrolls we want to look at tonight are scrolls, only 2 of which have been made available in the 90s. 2 others were made available earlier than that, a bit earlier, and then a few related ones. The theme is oriented around messianism, the idea of Messiah, and how that relates to Jesus. And these scrolls do make important contributions. Now, the first one is 4Q 246, which is called the Son of God text, usually. Well, what we discover in this scroll is that a messianic figure appears to be called the Son of God or Son of the Most High. And this is very intriguing. Why? What was not clear earlier in critical scholarship, New Testament critical scholarship, was whether or not Jewish people at the time of Jesus called the Messiah the Son of God. Now, the New Testament calls Jesus the Son of God. Where did that impulse come from? Some scholars, in fact many scholars, maintain that calling Jesus Son of God came from the Greco-Roman world. And it was because the Roman Caesar was called Son of God. And we can see that in inscriptions and in papyri, where routinely, and on coins, routinely, the Roman emperor is called Son of God. So was it Christianity in imitation of this tendency, trying to show that Jesus is not to be out-trumped by the Roman emperor, that he is the true Son of God? Perhaps this is therefore the origin of this tendency. Others said, no, Son of God really has its roots in the Old Testament. As you see in Psalm 2, for example, where the Messiah is said to have been begotten today, you are my son. Or 2 Samuel 7, where Nathan's great promise to David is that your descendant will be seated on the throne, and God says, I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. So is this where Son of God comes from? But the title Son of God itself isn't really used in a messianic sense. So some said, no, it doesn't come from the Old Testament. It comes from Christianity's interaction with Greco-Roman thinking and language as Christianity spread and moved out of Palestine into the Greco-Roman world. Then the discovery of 4Q 246 has really shaken up that critical thought. There are a few related texts that I want to mention briefly before we look at 4Q 246. The first one is 1QSA. S stands for the Hebrew word sarek, that means rule. A, the little a that follows the S, means that it's appendix number 1. There is the sarek, or rule scroll, followed by 2 appendices, which we call 1QSA and 1QSB. In 1QSA, there is reference to the Messiah. Let me read to you the appropriate part. Column 2, lines 11 and 12. This is the sitting of the men of renown, called to assembly for the council of the community, when God will have begotten the Messiah among them. And this text created a sensation when it was first published in the 1950s. Do we actually have here a text, a pre-Christian text, that refers to God's begetting the Messiah? And there was a great deal of controversy, and a key letter in the word Yolid, that means begotten, was not easily made out in the leather. In fact, as luck would have it, there was a pinhole right there in the leather, and in the passage of time, that hole just kept growing, and today the letter is gone altogether. And we have to look at older photographs and consult some of the early scholars in the 1950s that actually looked at the text. And it all comes down to how long the letter is and what shape it is and everything else. And so various recommendations have been made. Some have suggested it should read, when God will have brought with him the Messiah, or some other variation of that. However, I think the majority view still is today that begotten is probably the best restoration. And J.T. Millick and others who were eyewitnesses and looked at the scroll before the letter began to fade away and the leather simply disintegrate and vanish, argue that yes, Yolid probably was the best reading. There's a hole in the center of the word, and then there's the question of the final letter. Is it a D or is it a K? Yolid or Yolich? God will have brought, or God will have begotten? That's the question. Well, they admit that the letter really isn't long enough to be a final K. Yolich will have brought, or will have made to walk. It probably is a D, but maybe the scribe's pen had run out of ink as he was drawing this letter downward. I mean, this is how technical it gets, and so they'll get out microscopes and look. They will do various imagery, technology, computer-assisted work, and it's just amazing. It's space-age technology being used to restore the scrolls. Well, after a whole lot of restudy and reconsideration, the feeling still is, no, that I think he did mean to write the D. It is Yolid. Now, my own opinion of this is, I think the author is simply alluding to Psalm 2, where you have Mashiach, Messiah, in Psalm 2, verse 2, and you have Yolid, or a form of it, will begot. Today, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So there's nothing strange, nothing unusual, nothing that really goes beyond what the Hebrew Bible already declares. So I think that the original reading, in this case, in 1QSA, column 2, lines 11 and 12, that original reading still stands. But is this a pre-Christian, Christian idea, as it were? Is this text proclaiming that there will be a virgin birth of the Messiah? No, it's not, any more than Psalm 2 necessarily declares that either. What this is simply saying, in metaphorical terms, alluding deliberately to Psalm 2, is that God someday will raise up, or will somehow beget, his Messiah. That does not require a miraculous birth, a virgin birth, nor does it preclude it. It just leaves the question open. So that was one very important text. However, the title, Son of God, isn't really used there. But it is related. There's another text, 4Q 174. Document number 174 from K4. It is alluding to 2 Samuel 7, the other Old Testament passage I mentioned. I'll read just a part of it. Lines 10 through 14. And the Lord, or Yahweh, declares to you that he will build you a house, and I will raise up your seed after you, and I will establish his royal throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he shall be my son. Now this is paraphrasing parts of 2 Samuel 7, verses 11 through 13. This is the branch of David, who will stand with the interpreter of the law, who will sit on the throne in Zion at the end of days. So interpreters agree this is messianic. This branch of David is the person spoken of in Nathan's oracle in 2 Samuel 7. As it is written, and now the author will quote another Old Testament passage, Amos 9:11. As it is written, I will raise up the tent of David which is fallen. This is the fallen tent of David, who will stand to save Israel. All right, now we have a second text which applies a famous Old Testament passage, this time 2 Samuel 7, to the Messiah. But Son of God explicitly as a title is not used. Now we have a third text, very recently published, that bears on the question also. It is 4Q 369. It's called the Prayer of Enosh, I think now, by the official Dead Sea Scrolls editing team. According to Fragment 1, Column 2, lines 1 to 8, parts of which I shall read to you, we have, "You allotted his portion to cause your name to dwell there. It is the glory of your earthly land, and on it dwell your people. Your eye is on it, and your glory will be seen there forever. To his seed for their generations an eternal possession." Some of these sentences you will notice are incomplete, and that's simply because text is missing and we don't know how to restore it. "And all," we have a blank, "and you have made clear to him your good judgments." And then there's a blank, unfortunately, it's such a teasing moment. "In eternal light. And you made him a firstborn son to you," a blank, "like him for a prince and ruler in all your earthly land. The crown of the heavens and the glory of the clouds you have set on him." And the text continues to disintegrate, and there's no more. This firstborn son, is it messianic? Some interpreters think it is. Others say, no, actually it's just a prophecy. It's really an after-the-fact prophecy, a Vaticinium ex eventu, an after-the-fact prophecy, pretending to be a before-the-fact prophecy, predicting the coming of David, and not the Messiah. Well, the scholars are disputing it. Either way, he's not called Son of God, he's just called firstborn son. So here we have, up to this time, three texts, 1QSA, 4Q174, and 4Q369 that all potentially have some light to shed on the question of the Messiah called God's Son. Yet these three texts do not call him that. But now we have a fourth text, 4Q246. This text, unlike the other three, is written in Aramaic. It dates to about 50 BC. I will read most of it to you. All we have is one piece, very well preserved, remarkably well preserved, 2 columns on this one piece of leather. Here is most of it. "O king, wrath is coming to the world, and your years shall be shortened." Some part is missing. "Such is your vision, and all of it is about to come into the world. Amid great signs, tribulation is coming upon the land. After much killing and slaughter, a prince of nations will arise, the king of Assyria and Egypt," and some text is missing. "He will be ruler over the land. They will be subject to him, and all will obey him. Also his son will be called the Great One, and he shall be designated by his name. He will be called the Son of God. They will call him the Son of the Most High. But like the meteors that you see in your vision, so will be their kingdom. They will reign only a few years over the land, and people will trample people, and nation will trample nation, until the people of God arise, and then they will all rest from warfare. Their kingdom will be an eternal kingdom, and all their paths will be righteous. They will judge the land justly, and all nations will make peace. Warfare will cease from the land," and so on. It becomes paradise on earth. Here we have a text that refers to an eschatological figure who will come and who will be called Son of God and Son of the Most High. The question is this figure a Messiah figure? The word Messiah does not occur in this text. Now, we don't have all of the text, and maybe the word Messiah does occur somewhere else, but all we have are these 2 columns. But this individual is called Son of God. Now, here is the question. Is this Son of God figure expected to come in the future? Is he understood as the Messiah from the perspective of this author? The New Testament itself actually helps answer the question. there are four very interesting parallels between 4Q 246 and the Annunciation in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 1, verses 32 to 35. Let me read you the Annunciation. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there will be no end. And Mary said to the angel, How shall this be, since I have no husband? And the angel said to her, The Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. Now, I'm not going to get into the arguments relating to the infancy narrative and the question of the virgin birth and all the rest of that. But what I think is very interesting is that from Luke's perspective, at the very least, from Luke's perspective, who writes this account, Son of God, in fact, is a messianic title. And that would suggest that the title, the way it is used in 4Q 246, must, in all probability, be a messianic title as well. So in this case, the New Testament usage of this language, Son of God, Son of the Most High, ruling on the throne of his Father forever, and so on, these four parallels that have been identified by others, and I would recommend Joseph Fitzmyer to you in his commentary on Luke's Gospel, these parallels suggest that this language is indeed messianic language. So 4Q 246 seems to crack the nut finally. Here we have a text which is 50 BC, okay, a half century or so before Jesus is born, in Aramaic, the language of Jesus in the early church, and from Palestine, where Jesus ministered and where the church began. And in this text, an eschatological figure is identified as Son of God, and given these parallels with Luke 1, I and others are very confident that this must be a messianic figure we're talking about. So we come back to the original question. Is Son of God a title that the early church would not be familiar with and would not think to use with reference to the Messiah until Christianity had spread outside of Palestine and had encountered the Greco-Roman world, where Son of God is routinely used of, say, the emperors, the Caesars, and so on? I think the answer to that must be qualified. It must be no. Christianity would know that a messianic figure, in fact, could very well be called Son of God, and would know that in its Palestinian setting. And it's not necessary to argue that such an idea, such an epithet, Son of God, would not occur to Christians until Christianity had migrated outside of its Jewish cultural setting and penetrated into the Greco-Roman world. Now, Son of God, I can understand why Christianity would, in fact, use this title above other titles, such as Son of Man, because of what Son of God would mean, in fact, ringing in the ears of Greeks and Romans. Son of Man was a curious epithet, and outside of the Aramaic-speaking world, outside of the Jewish world, Son of Man, even though it was Jesus' favorite self-reference, didn't make a lot of sense. But Son of God, that was one you could run with. Now let's go to the second text from K4 that's of great interest to us, and that is 4Q 491. 4Q 491, which appears to be a hymn devoted to an exalted figure. I call it the hymn of the exalted one. And I'll read a portion of it. El Elyon, that is the God Most High, gave me a seat among those perfect forever, a mighty throne in the congregation of the gods. None of the kings of the east shall sit in it, and their nobles shall not come near it. No Edomite shall be like me in glory, and none shall be exalted save me, nor shall come against me, for I have taken my seat in the congregation in the heavens, and none find fault with me. I shall be reckoned with gods and established in the holy congregation. I do not desire gold as would a man of flesh. Everything precious to me is the glory of my God. The status of a holy temple, not to be violated, has been attributed to me, and who can compare with me in glory? What voyager will return and tell of my equivalent? Who laughs at Greece as I do, and who is like me in bearing evil? Moreover, if I lay down the law in a lecture, my instruction is beyond comparison with any man's. And who will attack me for my utterances? And who will contain the flow of my speech? And who will call me into court and be my equal? In my legal judgments none will stand against me. I shall be reckoned with gods, and my glory with that of kings' sons. Neither refined gold nor gold of Ophir can match my wisdom. This is a very egotistical hymn, as you can tell. And the original editor of this scroll, when 4Q491 was published some years back, thought that this must be the language of an angel who is exalting himself. But further reflection by various scholars, including Morton Smith and others, would suggest that no, why would an angel compare himself to certain kings and mortals and be worried about who would contradict his speech and so on? And it's been concluded that very likely this is a human being who's had some perhaps out-of-body experience, someone who has been caught up into the heavens and has been instructed by the heavenly hosts. And so instructed and so empowered, now believes he's so full of authority that who can contradict him on earth? Not even the kings of the East, the wise kings, no one can challenge his wisdom or his instruction because of the profound teaching and learning that he has experienced. Now, what's interesting about this is that this text could help explain Jesus' reply to Caiaphas, or Jesus' idea that he's the Son of Man. That is, in fact, my own view that that's where Jesus gets this Son of Man idea. Now, this is not a new idea, and it was talked about last night. Jesus sees himself as the Son of Man figure described in Daniel 7. And the idea of this is he's been exalted to heaven and senses that from God he has directly received authority, kingdom, and power. And he has authority on earth, therefore, to forgive sins, make pronouncements on the Sabbath, and so forth. Well, that might seem outrageous. Who would think these thoughts then, we might ask? But someone apparently did in 4Q491. And so when Jesus is brought before Caiaphas and he is asked, "Are you the Son of God? Are you the Messiah, Son of God?" Jesus replies, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven." And so this then, I think, falls into the same basic genre as 4Q491, this hymn of this exalted person. I'm not saying that Jesus is egotistical like this other individual or anything like that, but what 4Q491 does for us is it opens up the idea, the possibilities of such language and understanding that one could be taken up into heaven and invested with authority and could therefore speak this way. And so it helps us make more sense of what Jesus is saying here and to look at it as probably authentic tradition instead of some sort of a post-Easter Christological development, which is what some critical scholars in fact suggest. The third text, and it certainly is my favorite, 4Q521. 4Q521, the works of the Messiah. This text created a sensation in the early 90s when it was leaked out. It hadn't been published yet, and people began to talk about it. There's a text that talks about people being raised from the dead in the days of the Messiah, and people became very excited about this. There were some sneak previews published in the Biblical Archaeology Review, and pieces of the text began to be published, and now it's all available. Hebrew text, all the fragments, English translation, commentary, and everything. And we have seen much happen in the 1990s, I assure you. Let's begin with the question that the imprisoned John the Baptist sends to Jesus. I'm reading from Matthew 11, 2-6. The parallel, a fairly close parallel, is found in Luke 7, 19-23. But I'll read from what I think is actually the older, more primitive form of the tradition in Matthew 11, 2-6. John sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. And the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. Blessed is he who takes no offense at me. Now this is an interesting passage. We talked about the criterion of embarrassment last night in arguing for authentic material. Why would the early church invent a story where John the Baptist, famous John, who is recognized as Jesus' precursor and preparer, why would we have him languishing in prison, send messengers to Jesus to ask him, are you the one who is coming, or should we look for someone else? And that would be extremely embarrassing tradition. It's impossible to see it as composed by, invented by Christians. So most agree, yes, this is very likely authentic, genuine tradition. Then, why doesn't Jesus answer back more explicitly? Well, of course I am. Go back and tell John I'm the Messiah. Well, Jesus cannot do that. It is highly presumptuous. In the rabbinic tradition, for example, in order to debunk Simon Bar Kokhba, or better known, Bar Kokhba in Aramaic, son of the star, to debunk him after his failure, his disastrous war with the Romans, 132 to 135 AD, the rabbinic tradition, I think unfairly and cruelly, nobody likes a loser, 300 years later, they retell the story, and they have Simon claiming to be the Messiah, which was considered very arrogant. I am the Messiah, Simon said. And the rabbinic response was, oh yeah, really? Well, we will see. Well, Jesus, I am sure, would not walk around and say, I'm the Messiah, no matter how convinced he might be that he is God's eschatological agent for this crucial and critical time to announce the kingdom, to set in motion the redemption of Israel and the fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus is not going to introduce himself to people, say, hello, my name is Jesus Christ. He's sent by God, and God's Spirit will reveal to people who he is. So you can't expect Jesus to say, of course I'm the Christ. But couldn't he at least make his answer more explicit? This is what scholars wondered. Well, we did not have 4Q 521 until very recently. And when we read 4Q 521, we realize that Jesus, in fact, is answering indirectly John's question, and he is affirming his messianic identity. Let's read the text. 4Q 521, if we take fragments 2 and 4 and join them, we have most of column 2, lines 1 through 13. We do have some holes in it, especially in lines 9, 10, and 13. But most of it's there, and we can see the flow. For the heavens and the earth shall listen to his Messiah, and all which is in them shall not turn away from the commandments of the holy ones. Strengthen yourselves, O you who seek the Lord in his service. Will you not find the Lord in this, all those who hope in their heart? For the Lord seeks the pious and calls the righteous by name. Over the humble his spirit hovers, and he renews the faithful in his strength. For he will honor the pious upon the throne of the eternal kingdom, setting prisoners free, opening the eyes of the blind, raising up those who are bowed down. Forever I shall hold fast to the hopeful and the pious. And now we're listening to some material. And the Lord shall do glorious things which have not been done, just as he said, for he will heal the wounded. He will revive the dead. He will proclaim good news to the afflicted. And then the text breaks up. What we have here is a very interesting collocation of phrases taken from the very passages Jesus alludes to in his response to John the Baptist. In Isaiah 35, 26, and 61, 3 different passages in Isaiah, we have references to the blind receiving sight, the lame being able to walk, the deaf being able to hear, dead bodies being raised up, poor having good news preached to them. In 4Q 521, we have the sick or the wounded healed, the blind being able to see, the dead being revived, and the poor having good news preached to them. Nothing about the deaf, and of course nothing about lepers being cleansed, which is unique to Jesus' statement and is not found in Isaiah and is not found in 4Q 521. John Collins has suggested that 4Q 521 describes the expected activity of a prophetic Messiah. Collins is probably correct. In fact, "Are you the coming one?" could very well allude to Malachi 3:1. The observation that Isaiah 61 concerns someone anointed to bring good news, anointed by the Spirit, anointed, the same word from which we get Messiah, is also very suggestive. In fact, another Qumran document from Cave 11, called 11Q Melchizedek, explicitly links the Jubilee legislation of Leviticus 25 with Isaiah 61 and declares that it is to be fulfilled in the last days. Scholars have rightly studied this text as a possible backdrop to Jesus' use of Isaiah 61 and his pronouncements of the forgiveness of debts or sins, and often there is a wordplay in the Aramaic underlying debt and sin. The eschatological figure and vision of 11Q Melchizedek is probably based on the expected prophet or other anointed eschatological agent. And what I think we have here, then, is a messianic, although admittedly implicit and indirect, but a messianic reply by Jesus to John's question. But Jesus also appeals to exorcism as an indication that the eschatological day is at hand, and in this connection there's another important text that should be cited. This is from Cave 1, 1Q 27, Fragment 1, Column 1, lines 5 to 8. "This shall be the sign that this shall come to pass, when the sources of evil are shut up, and wickedness is banished in the presence of righteousness, as darkness in the presence of light, or as smoke vanishes and is no more. In the same way, wickedness will vanish forever, and righteousness will be manifest like the sun. The world will be made firm, and all the adherents of the secrets shall be no more. True knowledge shall fill the world, and there shall never be any more folly. This is all ready to happen, as it is a true oracle, and by this shall be known to you that it cannot be averted." So the idea of evil receding as the Spirit of God advances forward is taught in this text, and does seem to be taught by Jesus, and correlates at important points with 4Q 521's vision. The sign of the eschatological moment, according to this text, is when the sources of evil are shut up. According to the Testament of Moses, now this is a passage not found at Qumran, the Testament of Moses, already known prior to the discovery of the scrolls, but a text that scholars have often wondered if it is not as scenic. In other words, written by the same people who wrote some of the scrolls found at Qumran. In Testament of Moses, chapter 10, verse 1, we read, "Then his," that is referring to God's, "then God's kingdom will appear throughout his whole creation. Then the devil will have an end." And the parallel to Mark 3, 23 to 27 is very suggestive. Jesus counters the charge that he is casting out evil spirits through the power of Satan, where then he says, "If Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end." And in Greek, in Mark 3, the same words are used as in the Latin translation, which is all we have, of the Testament of Moses. When the kingdom of God appears, Satan will have his end. When the kingdom of God appears, light bursts forth and the darkness recedes. And I think what Jesus is saying, to combine all of this now, is when John asks, "Are you he who is coming, or do we look for another?" his response is, in fact, yes, of course. The deeds of the Messiah, the deeds of the Messianic era are taking place. Lots of good things are happening. Now the next text, 4Q 254. This is the fourth and final one. And I'd like to save time, try to finish in 5 or 6 minutes, because I want to hear your questions, and I want to allow time for discussions. 4Q 254, the two sons of oil. passage I'm interested in, fragment number 4, focuses on 2 sons of oil. That's literally what the Hebrew says. It is a fragment from Zechariah 4:14. Usually it is not translated that way. If you were to look it up in your English Bibles, you'll see 2 anointed ones or 2 something. It's just usually rendered a little differently. But literally it's 2 sons of oil. One of the most interesting features of Qumran Messianism was the appearance of 2 messiahs. I'm sure many of you will remember that. The fanfare in the 50s and 60s, did Qumran expect 2 messiahs? And how does this relate to Christianity and its anticipation of and belief that Jesus is the one Messiah? Why did Qumran believe in 2 messiahs? Was this an aberration? A Qumran innovation? Some scholars rightly responded no, for diarchic messianism is present in the Old Testament itself, which speaks of anointed kings and anointed high priests. Indeed, diarchy, rule by 2, is made explicit in the prophets Zechariah and Haggai. What is particularly interesting at Qumran has been the discovery of a commentary on Genesis 49, which quotes a portion of Zechariah 4:14, which speaks of 2 sons of oil. That is, an anointed king and an anointed high priest, whom God is expected to raise up at the end of days. The commentary on the patriarch Jacob's blessings on his sons appears to link the blessing on Judah with the 2 sons of oil. There remains some uncertainty because of the fragmentary nature of the text. However, Genesis 49, 10-12, the blessing on Judah, according to one of the Targums, Neophiti, is explicitly messianic. So are portions of Zechariah. It is reasonable to conclude, then, that Qumran's diarchic messianism, that is, its anticipation of 2 anointed figures, is no innovation, but an explicit development of what is already implicit in Old Testament Scripture. Now, how might this apply to Jesus? Let me make a suggestion to you. And I admit at the outset it is speculative. But in the triumphal entry in Mark 11, Jesus appears to have gone to some trouble to arrange for his entry, including the borrowed animal. The entry takes place, shouts of acclamation, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David, and everyone is excited. And Jesus goes up to the temple precincts, enters the city, wends his way up to the Temple Mount, enters the temple precincts, and then we have a very strange verse, Mark 11:11. He arrives in the temple precincts, and he looks around, looks at everything, and then retires because it's late. And that is so strange. Whoever is in charge among the disciples of protocol or Jesus' itinerary ought to be dismissed. It's such an anticlimactic conclusion to the triumphal entry. What I suggest to you is that Jesus is anticipating a greeting from one of the ruling priests, if not the high priest himself. There is evidence elsewhere in the Gospels, not only here where Jesus mounts on the animal, I think in deliberate correspondence to the expectations of Zechariah 9:9, which I'm not sure Mark knows about because he doesn't cite Zechariah 9:9, doesn't say something's been fulfilled. Matthew and John do that. Mark does not. Jesus mounts on the donkey, enters the city, and perhaps in anticipation of the diarchic messianism of Zechariah, which envisions 2 anointed sons of oil, Jesus the anointed one, who comes in the name of the Lord, who comes as the expected Davidic successor, is hoping that the anointed priest greets him, and the two anointed figures working together will in fact bring about the restoration of Israel. Now that may strike you as rather shocking and unusual, but I can't help but think that is what Jesus is attempting to do. I think Jesus enters the city knowing full well the dangers he faces, knowing of the possibility of his martyrdom, but nonetheless open to the possibility that the city will in fact receive him. Now, my other supporting line of evidence is found in Psalm 118, the very passage that is alluded to, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Also in the quotation of Psalm 118, 22 to 23 at the conclusion of the parable of the wicked vineyard tenants parable. In Aramaic, it's not a stone that's rejected, it is the sun, which is a remarkable correspondence then between the quotation of Psalm 118 and the theme of the parable itself. But also in the Aramaic paraphrasing version that develops in the synagogue, the figure who comes into the city and is greeted is none other than David, who, although initially rejected by the priest Samuel, is, after more thought, accepted and hailed. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We, the priests, bless you, the Aramaic text goes on to say. And the son of David is in fact accepted. And there's a great celebration at the temple and sacrifices offered up. So if we keep in mind the Aramaic, portions of its interpretation of which may have been in Jesus' mind and may be traced back to the first century, keep that in mind, as well as the diarchic messianism, the two anointed figures of Zechariah 4:14, and Qumran's own belief that the two anointed ones of Aaron and of Israel are expected to arise at the end of days, then perhaps we understand what went wrong with the triumphal entry. Jesus goes up to the temple precincts, not just to look around and then retire because it's late, but is hoping, in fact, to be greeted by the ruling priests in the fashion suggested by the Aramaic paraphrase of Psalm 118. Jesus' hopes were not realized. He was ignored. He returns. Next time he's in the temple precincts, he then makes some critical comments. And of course, he then is approached by the ruling priests, not to be greeted, not to be hailed in a friendly manner, but challenged. Who are you and by what authority are you doing these things? And of course, we all know what this develops into, and it continues to escalate until finally the ruling priests, in collaboration with the scribes and elders, of course, conspire to arrest Jesus and hand him over to the Romans. I think these particular texts that we've reviewed this evening, some new, some not so new, all of them combine together to give us some new insights into Jesus' messianic self-understanding and possibly help us understand also his aims and intentions and some of his actions. I'll conclude here now. I thank you and look forward to your questions and comments.